Hello world, Noah here, and welcome to the next lecture in the CS University series of lectures. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about user input. So up until now, we've written some programs, and they've been pretty basic, and maybe you've written some programs yourself. But these programs have been pretty basic, and they have always done the same thing every single time you run them, which is good. And we can write some programs that work this way. But eventually we want these programs to be able to change their behavior in certain ways. And the first way that we want to do that is we want to enable the user to provide input. And so in the previous lab, we actually had we were doing the cookies and the friends, and we had those variables, for the number of cookies and the number of friends. And those were variables in our code. So you could change those variables, and then the output of our code would change, and that's great. But we can do a little bit better than that, because the problem is that every time you want to run that program with a different number of cookies or a different number of friends, then you need to open up the code file in your editor, and you have to change the variable and then save the file and then run it. Right, which isn't a huge deal, I guess, but it's a little bit annoying. But the real problem is, let's say that you gave this program to your friend, and your friend had Python installed on their computer, because, installing Python's easy, but they don't actually know, how to write code in Python. And if you told them, oh, you just have to open this in an editor and, change these lines or whatever, they may find that confusing. And especially when we write some more complicated programs, it will just be too much. Right? We don't want to make people edit our programs in order for them to run correctly. You wouldn't want to have to open the source code to Google Chrome and type in the website you want to go to and then build and run Google Chrome in order to navigate to a different website, right? That would be silly. And so we allow the user to actually input some data into the program, and we can have the program, work according to the data that's typed in. So that's the motivation for this. I think it should be pretty clear. We want to let the users type in data, and we can use the data that they typed in. So how exactly do we do that? Well, Python has a nice built-in function called, what else, but the input function. And so we can use this input function to get some user input. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So the way that you use this function is very, very simple. You just write, the word input and then an empty set of parentheses, just like that. And so what happens is when Python, when you run your program and Python gets to this line of code right here, it's going to stop the execution, and it's going to wait for the user to type something in. Then the user is going to go and type in, whatever they're going to type in, and then they hit enter. And when the user hits enter, then whatever the user typed in will be passed back, as the result of this function, and then the program will resume execution. So basically, you get to this input line, and the program waits until you get input, and once you get the input, we can move on. Right? And so just writing this input line by itself doesn't really make sense, because, the program would halt, the user would type something in, and then the program would resume, but we're not doing anything with with what the user gave back. And so we want to actually do something with that result. And so let's just store it into a variable, of course, because then we can reference the variable later. And so let's just imagine that we're writing a program that asks the user, to enter their name. And so I'm going to store this in a variable called name. So I just say name equals input, and I call the input function right there. And so what happens again, we get to this line, the program halts, the user types something in and hits enter, and then whatever the user types in as their input will be assigned to the variable name. So if I run this program and I type in Noah, then the variable called name will have the value of Noah. And if I ran, this program again and I instead typed in, let's say, Nick, then, the variable name would have the value of Nick. And in fact, whatever I type in, that's what value this variable will have. So now you can see how we can get user input, but it'll go, right into this variable, and we already are used to dealing with variables, and you kind of know how to deal with them. And so, you could write a very simple program. You could say something like, hello, name, just like that. And so, if I run this program, let's say I run this program here, and I type in Noah, and then I hit enter, and that symbol just means that I hit enter. You wouldn't actually write it. So I type no, I hit enter, and then it would just print out this message, hello space Noah, just like that. And whatever I had typed in is what it printed out. So if I typed in, ABC, it would have said hello ABC. And so that's it. Use the input function to get a line of input from the user, and then it goes into a variable, and you can use the variable just like any other ordinary variable. So let's move on then. Let's say that we want to have a number input, right? In our previous lab, we dealt with the number of friends and the number of cookies, and those were both clearly numbers. So when we call the input function, and this is really important, when we call the input function, it will always give us back a string. Even if, the input that we type in, let's say we type in the number 3 and then we hit enter, it's going to give us back the string that contains the number 3 in it. It's going to give it as a string, not as an integer. And that's really important. The idea, and this is, one of the ideas that I will keep on bringing up, is we want consistency. And so in this case, I just so happened to type in something that was a valid number, but I could have easily just typed in, ABC or, 3A, for example. And obviously those are not valid numbers. And so just because I happen to type in a valid number doesn't mean that I want the input to be a number, because then it would be kind of confusing, when is it a number, when is it a string, whatever. And so we're just going to say that the input is always going to be a string, because that's how Python works. The input's always a string, but then how do we treat these inputs like they're numbers? Because, with the number of friends and the number of cookies, we were doing math, and we can't do math with strings. We need to do math with numbers. And so let's take a look at that. So let's just say, this is sort of a side note. Let's just say, that I do the same thing that we did before. So friends, and I call the input function, like that. So this variable called friends is equal to input. And again, if I type in 3, it's going to be the string 3. And so if I tried to do some sort of math with it, if I tried to do, friends times 2, for example, whatever that means in context. If I tried to do that, it would not give you the behavior that you're expecting, because friends is a string. If I did friends times 2, friends plus 1, anything involving math, it would give you weird behavior. Sometimes it would be an error, sometimes it would be something completely unexpected. We'll take a look at all of those cases in future lectures. But the point is that it won't work as we want it to, because we want to treat this input as a number. And in this case, we want to treat it as an integer. And so what we can do is there's a special function, or there's two that we'll look at, but there's a special function called the int function. And so what happens is when you call this int function, when you use this int function, you pass it something, and it will try to convert it to an integer. And if that thing that you pass it, represents a valid integer, it will give you that thing as an integer. And if it doesn't, it will give you an error message. And so, for example, if I say int and I type 3 in quotation marks, it's the string 3, it will give me the integer 3 back, which is what we want. If I pass it int, a, for example, which is not a valid integer, then it would give me an error. It would actually crash my program. And in quite a while from now, we will look at, how to handle errors like these. But for now, let's not worry about it. So if they type in an invalid input, the program will crash, but it's really not that big of a deal. So anyways, the idea is we have friends right here, and we're calling input. But what we want to do is we want to take that input and convert it to an integer, right? So that we can treat it like a number. And so what we can do is we want to call the int function on the input. And so to do that, we just go like this, int input, just like that. And so what will happen is, this is going to go from the inside out. So it's going to do the input part before it does the int. And so what will happen is first the input part will go. So again, it'll halt the program, wait for the user to type something and hit enter, and then it'll give that value back as a string. And then whatever value gets back goes right into the int function. We're saying we want to take the string that we get and convert it into an integer, right? And then, whatever result we get out of that will go into the variable called friends. And so now friends will actually be an integer. which is exactly what we want. And of course, if the user types something that's not a valid integer, then the program would crash with an error message. But again, we're not going to worry about that at the moment because, eventually we'll learn how to deal with that. And so that's how you deal with integers. And to deal with floating point numbers, there's an equivalent function called float. It works the exact same way. You give it, some parameter, and if that parameter represents a valid float, it will convert it for you and give it to you as a float. If not, it'll crash with an error message. And so we can do, the exact same thing. So like, let's say, that I want to ask the user, how much does something cost? And I want to treat it as a floating point number, of course, because I want to be able to do math with it. And so all I do is I say float of input, like that. And so it's going to get the user's input first, and then it's going to convert it into a floating point number. And so now I can do math with it. And like here, this code that I wrote where I did friends times 2, now this will work as we expect because friends is an integer, it's a number, and, multiplication with 2 numbers is very easy. And so that's all. The idea is that the user input is always a string, and we can use the int or float functions to convert it into numeric inputs, number inputs, which then we can use to do math. And so that's very important. Next, we can talk about a special feature of the input function, which is actually very useful. And so let's just go back to the first program that I wrote back on the input function page. I'll just rewrite it here really quick. So what we did is we said name is equal to input, like that, and then we printed out hello name. And hopefully that's legible. It's just the word hello. It doesn't really matter. So, okay. So this was our nice little 2-line program that we had here. But what happens is if we try to run this program, the first thing that happens is we see this input function right here. And so, again, this causes the program to halt, which is what we expect. But if you gave this to your friend and you said, here's the program that does, whatever you want it to do, just run it and use it. Well, if they go to run it, they're going to be presented with a blank screen because the code is waiting for the user to type something in. But the problem is that you never told the user to type something in. And so that may be okay for you because you wrote the program and you know how it works. But if you tried to show it to another person, they'd probably be very confused because they'd run the program, nothing would happen, and they'd probably think it's either frozen or it crashed or something went wrong with it. And so the idea is that we want to prompt the user to actually, input something. We want to say, please enter your name or please enter whatever they're trying to enter. And so, there's 2 ways that you could do this. You could write a print statement, above this. So before the input runs, you could write a nice print statement saying, please enter your name. And then, the program would halt, but the user would know what to do. The other thing is the input function. You can actually give it a prompt and it will display that prompt, before halting for the input. And so what you can do is inside of those parentheses, you can pass it a string. So you can do something like, please enter your name, space, and quotation mark. And so what will happen now is the program will run and it will say, please enter your name, and then it'll wait for the user to enter their name. And so you can either do the print statement or you can do this nice prompt that you have right here. And the only difference is if you do a print statement, it's going to say, please enter your name, and then you're going to type the name in on the next line. And this is with print. But if you do it, with the prompt, if you pass it to the input function, then what'll happen is it'll actually say, please enter your name, and then the user will actually type their name in on the same line. And so that's why I put the colon and the space there, because the user input will go on the same line. And I personally think this probably looks better, and it's a little bit cleaner because you only have 2 lines instead of 1 line. But it's up to you. They're both perfectly fine. The one thing that I will say is something that confuses a lot of students is this right here. This, again, is the prompt right? This is just a message that shows up to the user, because some students got confused and thought that that was the actual input, that the user was giving, which doesn't really make sense, right? Because you can't code the user's input into your code because you don't know what they're going to type in. But that was something that was confusing to people. And so just to be clear, that's the prompt. It's a message that shows up and tells the user what sort of input you're expecting. It just makes your program look nicer, and it makes it more usable. And so that's all for the prompt parameter. It's just a nice thing you can have, or you can use a print statement before you call input, whatever you prefer. And so that's all for this lecture. This is just a look at the input function, how you can get user input, how you can get the input as an integer or a float, and then the prompt parameter to make your programs a little bit more usable. So in the lab, we will actually work with the input function to write a very simple program. And hopefully, if any of this was a little bit confusing, it will all be covered in the lab, and that should make it more clear. So that is all for this lecture. Hope you found this helpful, and I will see you guys in the next one.